BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Icon Biotech. As a world-leading healthcare intelligence and clinical research organization dedicated to the needs of small and mid-sized biopharma companies, Icon Biotech helps biotech organizations meet their critical milestones and deliver data and evidence-based results to investors, large pharma partners, and regulatory authorities. Icon Biotech advances clinical research by offering integrated outsourced services and solutions delivered by dedicated biotech teams and management that understand the different pressures faced by biotechs in their drive to solve today's challenges without losing sight of their mission to deliver life-changing innovations tomorrow.
Will political uncertainty resolve in biotech's favor or lead to economically damaging policy under the new administration? It's BioCentury's 2025 Public Markets Preview, which includes highlights from our four-part look at the 2025 catalysts that could drive biotech in the new year, bispecifics, modalities, I&I, and neuro and obesity, plus life science VCs driving AI innovation. We have the view from the interface in 2025. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor and host of the BioCentury This Week podcast. And joining me, we have a whole suite of the editorial team here today.
Simone Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Selena Koch, executive editor.
Stephen Hansen, director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Lauren Martz, executive director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Karen Koch-Tesman, director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And the one voice you did not hear was Steve Usden, our Washington editor, and there's good reason for that. New week, new president. What does the new administration mean for biotech? Tune in to a special edition of our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, this Thursday to get Steve's take. He'll be in conversation with Simone, and that'll be out on our YouTube channel and all of your favorite podcast emporiums. Okay, a few months back, investors seemed pretty convinced that 2025 would be the year that biotech broke free of its macroeconomic prison, or so Stephen was hearing as he was talking to people throughout the year. And well, is that still the case, Stephen?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so kind of, I guess, taking you behind the curtain a bit. Yeah, as you said, sort of back in September, October, kind of pre-election, pre-US election time, I thought I had a pretty good idea of what the 2025 preview was going to say. You know, I was pretty comfortable with where things were going and everyone seemed to be on the same page. Then November 5th happened, and a lot of things seemed to change for a lot of the investors and bankers that I chat with regularly. There was just so much uncertainty on their end that I decided this year the best way to kind of frame the story was, rather than ask them what they think was going to happen in the coming year, since none of them really had a great idea as to what was going to happen, we kind of framed it as kind of what are their bear and bull arguments for the sector? Like, for things to go really well for biotech, what needs to happen? And for things to go really bad, what would need to happen? And so that's kind of how we frame this story. I started with the bear argument just because that was the one where I think there was the most kind of consensus. And so for that, a lot of it kind of boils down to two simple words: continued uncertainty. And obviously, a lot of this stems from the incoming administration and just the general unpredictability as to what is going to happen on the policy side and how that's going to impact, for a large part, how that's going to impact the macroeconomic environment and the U.S. economy. As we've seen over the past couple of years, you know, biotech is now so closely tied to a lot of these macroeconomic factors, such as interest rates, that policies that may initially seem like they're, you know, not really all that connected to the biotech sector, if they have an impact on interest rates, that's where we can see an impact. And so investors were talking about the threat of tariffs, and, you know, the thread there is if tariffs were brought in on a, you know, sort of broadly implemented basis, they would likely be inflationary. If inflation goes up, then you have the potential for the Fed to have to pivot. And, you know, instead of bringing in their interest rate cuts that are expected this year, they might have to change course on that. There were all these sort of very widespread worries that investors were telling me about. The problem that they have is they don't know whether they're real worries or not. And I think that's what gives them so much sort of pause and concern is they're not sure what they need to actually factor into their future investment case or what is sort of what's real or kind of what's a mirage. And just that raw level of uncertainty makes it really hard for investors.
So, Stephen, I got to tell you a little bit critical here of investors on my part, actually, because there was every possibility that Trump would get elected. So the idea that this was a surprise on November 5th is them not doing their job properly, if you ask me. I mean, this was, it was at least 50-50 chance, right? As it happened, it was more. And I think that, and you put this in your very good analysis, part of it is Trump and the uncertainty. But I think one of the big factors was when he went for RFK Jr., which I think a lot of people had thought he's not going to do that. And so that there's two parts of that. One is in and of itself, that's a concern that you can talk about. But I think also it added to the uncertainty in that, oh, wait, he might actually do some of these quote unquote crazier things, edgier things, if you like, that cast more unpredictability. I think before the election, there was a lot of feeling, well, if it's Trump, it'll be good for business and that he'll be tamed. And I think that was kind of a signal that, well, will he? You might want to take it from there.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It wasn't that people were, not expecting, not weighing the possibility that he could win. I think, of course, they were. But as you say, they were taking this sort of pro-business, sort of, the same arguments that we heard in the run up to the 2016 election that, Trump would be pro-business and, reduced regulations, these sorts of arguments. I think what happened is, as you rightly point out, when he started making the nominations, and I don't think it was, obviously RFK was kind of the headline, obviously for the healthcare sector, but even some of the other nominations that were coming out and the fact that they were on face value, not very well suited maybe for those jobs, and sort of just that pointing to the potential chaos that could be coming. And I think that is what really sparked a lot of these greater concerns from investors than what they maybe would have expected from maybe a normal progression of, into a new administration. And obviously just mentioning RFK specifically, there were concerns about, well, what, how much involvement is he going to have, in FDA? Is it going to be like other HHS secretaries where you don't see any of their fingerprints on what happens at FDA? Or is he going to be more wanting to be more involved on the bull argument side? Their arguments, well, he's more interested in food and agriculture, and so he's going to be kind of hands off on the pharmaceuticals aspect.
But there's other uncertainties within FDA, right? People are leaving. There's going to be a new FDA commissioner.
That's right.
So,
and this was what other ones brought out, is that you could potentially have a major brain drain from the agency. You also have now this other unknown factor of the DOGE agency, the government efficiency agency, coming in, and what impact are they going to have on FDA? I had someone mention to me like, well, what if they just come in and say, well, we need to cut 30% of the staff? Like, what impact would that have on the agency to be able to maintain its core functioning? Again, nobody knows whether these are real concerns or whether these are just imagined concerns, but that's the problem, right? Is that you have no idea what to expect.
And so what are some of the effects in like right now that this uncertainty is happening? So in the lead up to the new year, there was talk of maybe some IPOs happening, and tell us how that's shaping up.
Yeah, so kind of the immediate impact. So I had quite a few bankers that were saying that there were maybe about 10 companies that had been lining up, if market conditions were right, they had been lining up with the idea that they were going to be filed and ready to price their IPOs in the week ahead of JP Morgan. Now that we're, a couple weeks into the year, that didn't happen. We didn't have any of those companies get ready to price and go out in that year because of the market conditions and where things were at. Now we've had what I would say there have been 4 sort of like major NASDAQ IPOs, meaning companies that are looking to raise real money. 2 filed earlier this year. We had 2 file last Friday. None of them have priced yet. Assuming those progress along, we'll kind of see what happens. But it basically means that what had been expected to be a good year, or potentially a good year for IPOs, given how many of high quality private companies are out there and potentially in a position to where they're clinical stage, they've done their crossover rounds, they've reset their valuations, they're ready to go. But now, it's looking like what might have been an early IPO window. Now their expectations are, well, maybe we need to wait and see how some of these things play out, see whether some of these uncertainties are real or if they're imagined. And so that could mean that while we might see some IPOs get out in the first half, what people are expecting now is that the second half of the year is probably going to be the time frame where we're going to see a larger portion of those deals getting done.
Stephen, with such a backlog of companies that have raised crossover rounds, I mean, we're going into like a couple of years now. Will the market be able to absorb that? What will happen to these companies?
It's not going to be a flood. And the thing is, there's enough money on the private side that, as some of these investors said, they're actually holding back their highest quality companies because they can just keep them private longer, right? And you can just build value on the private side. You don't have to deal with all of the issues that come with being a public company, but that's kind of being reserved for kind of the chosen few of all these VCs portfolios, So other companies are going to be in a bit, maybe a tougher position if they don't have investors, insiders that are willing to kind of kick the can down the road. They're going to be in a bit more of a tougher spot as to having to decide what to do next.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple more points about this, Stephen. One is just going back to the FDA. I think that people think about it at a high level, efficiency and so on. Maybe you do need some changes at the FDA, but I think the specific concern is that drug approvals are going to get slowed down, right? You're going to have fewer staff means fewer people to have these FDA meetings, and the whole process gets slowed down. And that is specifically bad for bringing the generalists in, right?
That's right.
Generally, but they will look at this as a barrier to actually seeing things move forward. Even if at a long-term horizon, it's good for the country or the FDA, and that's questionable. But what I'm saying is that that's the immediate,
and it'll be and it's a negative impact on the entire sector, right? Because this is the gate in which the entire sector needs to be able to navigate through. And so if you slow that down, that has pretty broad implications.
Stephen, one thing I heard at JP Morgan, and I want to know whether your investors felt this as well, is that the one thing that Trump is singularly sensitive to is the stock market. And so if that is not going in the right direction for him, were you feeling that investors sort of thought that he would take whatever action he can take, or, in order to, that would influence his policies, seeing the stock market rise is important to him?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, he obviously likes to be seen as having a positive impact on the economy. The question is whether biotech participates in that, or whether generalists stick to the tech and AI as the place where they want to play, and biotech gets left behind, as has kind of been the case in the last couple of years. So that's still, I think, the unknown thing as to how much participation biotech gets in that market, should he be a boon to the market.
All right, moving away from politics, let's turn to the catalysts that have the potential to drive biotech in the new year. Lauren led the way on sort of a new look of our annual buy-side issue, where Lauren looked at all the upcoming milestones with an assist from other members of our team, Stephen, Karen, Danielle, Selena, and she divvied it up into 4 buckets: bispecifics, new modalities, I&I, that's the fan favorite there, and of course, obesity and neuro. Lauren, where do you want to start here?
Thanks, Jeff. I want to start by saying that this is just a selection of the catalysts that we came across that are interesting. There's so much this year that I found really important, but these are just some that we'll be watching. So bispecifics appears to be a major theme going into this year, I think, for 3 reasons. The headline news is the phase 3 data from a global trial of ivonescimab from Summit and Akeso. So this is the bispecific antibody that outperformed Keytruda last year in non-small cell lung cancer in a study conducted in China. So this is the global trial in the same indication. The study is designed a little differently. That said, I think if the trial is positive, this justifies all the investments that have been made in these bispecifics, the VEGF bispecifics, the PD-1 bispecifics that have followed that data, and it validates the mechanism, which everyone's been looking for, the next Keytruda. Maybe this could be it. If it's negative, it's possible it could resurface concerns over the quality of data coming from China. And again, the trial is designed differently, so conflicting results could mean a lot of things. The second bispecifics trend is the masked bispecifics that we saw gain a lot of momentum last year from the data from CytomX and Janux. There will be updated data from some of those programs and some others. And then the third is T-cell engaging bispecifics in autoimmune diseases. So this is part of that bigger trend of B-cell depletion with the CAR Ts that looks so promising. It's leading to long-term remissions in B-cell driven autoimmune diseases. And the question going into this year is whether other B-cell depleting mechanisms, T-cell engagers, for example, and also allogeneic CAR Ts could have similar results as the autologous CAR Ts and could be easier to manufacture and more accessible. One thing that was really interesting in the catalyst that we have for this year is that allogeneic CAR Ts outnumber autologous CAR Ts, at least in the ones that we were able to find, by quite a bit. So I'm really interested to see how those allogeneics perform in these indications. And then again, for the T-cell engagers, we've seen early evidence from investigator-sponsored studies that this might work. There was data for Blincyto in a few indications. We'll see some company-sponsored data this year from Cullinan, for example.
Lauren, one thing that I have wondered is regarding the bispecifics versus CAR Ts, be they allogeneic or autologous, in autoimmunity. And, one thing I'd heard is that the efficacy is so much better in cancer with the CAR Ts, and that even in autoimmunity, they probably need this T-cell function, that this idea that basically CAR Ts will have an efficacy edge over bispecifics. How do you think about that?
So it's all about tissue penetration when it comes to these B-cell depleting mechanisms. We have B-cell depleting mAbs that are very effective for a lot of these autoimmune indications for a limited amount of time. People are getting rituximab infusions every 6 months because the cells that you're trying to kill exist in circulation and in the tissues, and mAbs can't penetrate the tissues. So where CAR Ts have an advantage is the ability to get into the tissues that are inflamed and get the B cells there and in circulation. It's sort of unknown how well a T-cell engager, which will bring the T cells that can penetrate tissues to the inflamed tissues, will work. And, whether that can be as effective as actual cells that are designed to target those B cells in the tissues themselves. So, where allogeneic comes in is these are T cells too. They generally don't persist in patients as long yet as the autologous CAR Ts. So with inflammatory diseases, it's possible that you don't need them to persist as long. So I think that's why a lot of companies are trying to test this theory and see if this is the application where that mechanism will work.
And do you have any line of sight as to the timeline on when data might read out from the different ones to address that question?
Sure. So bispecifics, we know Cullinan is year end. There are a few others scattered throughout the year. With the CAR Ts, again, it's throughout the year. We'll have, some companies have just stated that they'll have data this year. We have a few in the first half, including autologous CAR T from Cabaletta, which will be tested in a new indication. We have a gamma delta CAR T from Adicet with data expected this half. So again, this is all proof of concept data for these programs. I think it'll be a steady stream this year, as continuing what we were seeing last year.
Well, there's crossover, of course, between the bispecific catalyst you talked about in that article and what's happening in I&I. Maybe we should just transition into that now. I think one of the take-homes from the I&I story is that there's a new set of indications that are kind of becoming competitive areas. You want to tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So, these aren't entirely new indications that we've called out, but there's definitely a shift from a huge amount of data, big readouts in what we consider the big I&I indications like psoriasis and atopic derm, rheumatoid arthritis, to quite a few readouts in some other indications that have been around but haven't gotten as much attention, haven't seen as much progress. So, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, there are many phase 2 readouts this year of different mechanisms. This seems to be a big focus among some companies because the percentage of responders just continues to be disappointing with a lot of the established mechanisms there. I think a lot of eyes are on HS and the phase 3 results that are coming from MoonLake's sonelokimab.
Steven knows how to pronounce it. What's HS?
Hidradenitis suppurativa.
Woo!
Yeah, one of You're absolutely right, Lauren. There's a lot of really interesting competition going on there. Be interested to see how sonelokimab sort of plays out because they had some of the best phase 2 data in that setting. So be interesting to see whether they can translate that to phase 3.
I mean, one of the things that's just so interesting, and we're seeing it now in I&I, is that a disease like this, which, as you say, was just like not on anybody's radar, I don't know, 3-4 years ago or something, is now one of the hottest topics. And so it's always interesting for us to think what's going to be the next, I'm just going to go with HS here, but what's going to be the next HS type of disease? And I don't suppose you've yet got any inkling of that, Lauren, right?
It's hard to tell. I mean, we're continuing to follow the indications where there's been some promising early stage data. Urticaria, there are several different types of it, where last year we saw a lot, these are hives. There are different things that cause the hives and different mechanisms that may work for the different types. But there was some promising data last year from a few companies. We'll see updates from multiple trials that read out last year, including Jasper. And tox has been a problem with the c-KIT inhibitors in that indication. So there are some new mechanisms there as well. I think that's one to watch.
Stephen, I want to bring you back in here. You've been following obesity for quite a while now. What are you looking for this year?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. No, I think this will be another year of continued sort of optimism for obesity. Yeah, a couple of things that I'm watching for. So there are going to be some, we should get more proof of concept for a couple of new mechanisms sort of beyond the incretin space. So we should see the first sort of proof of concept clinical data for an NLRP3 inhibition. We should also see more sort of myostatin inhibition. So the sort of weight loss, sort of higher quality, better quality, fat loss versus, muscle loss type of data coming this year. And then the other sort of big one is, given the disappointing readout we saw from CagriSema at the end of 24 in their first phase 3 readout, Novo is going to be having more of that data coming from that program. With sort of the big one that I'm sort of looking forward to is there should be phase 3 data from CagriSema head to head with Zepbound from Lilly. And so I think that'll give us the best sense of whether CagriSema really is differentiated or whether it's really similar, which that's what the initial phase 3 data looked like and why Novo lost so much in market cap at the end of last year. So I think it'll, again, be another year where there's really a lot of interest in this space.
Yeah, the new mechanisms front, Wave Life Sciences has a pretty interesting genetic target for obesity, the INHBE. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that particular acronym, but it's when you have heterozygous loss of function in people, they tend to have a much healthier metabolic profile and they're resistant to obesity. That's early. They're hoping to have phase 1 data this year, but that'll be an interesting one to watch.
Yeah. And I think there's also quite a bit going on in neuro, isn't there, Selena?
Always. Yeah. Let's see. So here's another place where there's crossover.
It must be nice to say always, Selena. That wasn't the case a couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, a lot of it's in rare neuro, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But crossing over from the obesity space, semaglutide is going to read out towards the end of the year in a phase 3 trial for Alzheimer's disease. So everybody's watching that.
That's interesting. I had an investor comment to me like, I guess we'll find out whether Alzheimer's is really diabetes of the brain or not based on that result.
People have been saying that for a while. But yeah, I think a lot of the action in neuro is in rare neurology. So with this feeling that the accelerated approval pathway might be a bit more open for these types of diseases than historically was the case, we are seeing, so Huntington's has been like heating up, getting interesting. I don't know that we're going to have a lot of data from that this year, but everybody's certainly we'll be watching any news about the development plans from Unicure, PTC, Wave. They all have said that they've had some discussions with FDA where the agency has been open to either intermediate or surrogate endpoints. So seeing how those development plans roll out will be important. And I think PTC will have some follow-up data this year as well to watch. And then there's the companies who are looking at neurodegenerative diseases that aren't monogenic, but finding monogenic subsets within them, kind of like the SOD1 ALS tofersen mold, and following in that path. So we're going to start to see data from GRN mutant frontotemporal dementia this year, GBA mutant Parkinson's disease. So these are rare subsets of these bigger diseases, but the driver is known, which takes some of the biological risk out of that. and could themselves probably be amenable to accelerated approval. Who knows? We'll see. Also a readout from Ionis and Alexander disease and a whole set of companies working on various MPS diseases. Here's one I can't pronounce: mucopolysaccharidosis.
Polysaccharidosis.
Yeah, right. So that's one where there was a meeting between FDA and all the various stakeholders and progress made where the agency said, okay, yes, there is a surrogate endpoint, a biomarker, heparan sulfate, that might be acceptable for these diseases. And that just unlocked all of this progress. And now you're having companies move forward with submissions. So Denali and REGENXBio both looking to submit first quarter for MPS II. We saw Ultragenyx submit in last quarter for MPS, I think it's 3A, and they're expecting an FDA decision in the second half of this year. So that is an interesting space that could finally make some progress. But speaking of rare, it's not just rare neurology. I think rare is really interesting right now, despite this massive pivot, I guess, that we've been talking about over the last few years, where everybody wants really big markets. They want the obesity, the cardiovascular, this and that. There's just a lot going on in rare. And Lauren, you wrote about some of that in your story about new modality showdowns. You want to just give us a couple of examples?
Sure. Yeah. So we haven't been hearing that much excitement about genetic therapies from investors lately. But when we were looking through the catalysts, I realized it's an important year for defining where the different modalities will ultimately be used and which ones will be the most successful. So a lot of these are for rare indications. What we've seen is there's a lot of clustering of genetic medicines in the same limited set of indications. This isn't new, but this year we'll see launches from some of the more advanced modalities, the antisense, the siRNAs, in some of the same indications where there will be proof of concept data from some of the earlier stage genetic medicines. So just one example is alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. Will have phase 1-2 data from Beam with its base editor, Caro with an RNA editor. We've recently seen some data from Wave that validated the RNA editor idea. And this is an indication where Intellia, with its gene editing CRISPR-based insertion therapy, has just dropped out of the race. So there are quite a few more that are mentioned in the story.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting area in general. Selena, this is true, I think, also for the diseases with rare indications, and then the evaluation, as you point out, of modalities, where quite often rare diseases are sort of great testing grounds for a mechanism or a modality. One of the things that you've written previously about, Lauren, though, is that especially in rare diseases, and I think with gene therapies, when everybody goes into the same one, that creates, a lot of difficulties in terms of actually running the trials. And we also have no idea how many entrants the market can tolerate. So is that something that's going to be an overhang on some of these this year?
Of course. I think there's also, is the market, are patients ready for one-time therapies, is something that's really going to define how these perform. Obviously the one-time therapies are generally not on the market yet, but you have the antisense and the siRNA that seem to be doing a very good job of knocking down the targets that base editors, CRISPR-Cas9 are also going after. So if you have comparable efficacy with dosing every 6 months or one-time dosing with unknown long-term risks, we'll just have to see how these perform.
Right. So the catalysts themselves will tell us about those products, but there's also a lot more writing on some of the results this year. And as you point out, Selena, this people remaining in rare diseases will probably over the next 2-3 years will be addressing a lot of these questions.
All right, going back to tech and AI, Karen took a look at how VCs who are focused on AI-driven drug development are thinking about the resources and strategies needed to turn this great promise into reality. It's a 2-part story series that you can find on biocentury.com. Karen, what did you learn talking to the VCs that you spoke with here?
Thanks, Jeff. I thought the VCs would be an important place to delve into the moment right now in the tech bio interface, the AI bio interface, because they're often looking in a portfolio way across technologies, across strategies. And the other thing that is really interesting there is that they are not a monolith. They're not sort of all cheerleaderly, boostery in the same kind of ways. They have nuanced differences in terms of how they approach this interface. And that's what I sought to dig into. And especially in this moment, because I think a lot of us are feeling like the generative AI world is kind of becoming more and more real in our day-to-day lives. And so it felt like an important moment to check in. And so it was interesting to see kind of the different personas of VCs in this space. On one pole, I guess you can think of it, is the flagship pioneerings of the world, of which there is one flagship pioneering. One is that they're taking a pretty holistic approach, and they're trying to think about things like, what do we not even have the compute technology to do now, but we would have it in 8 years? And so what kinds of problems would we solve? So that really far reaching into the future. And they're also trying to build a lot of it themselves and build a lot of centralized capabilities for the portfolio companies to draw on. And that's a very different approach from, say, the DC VC bios of the world, who say they kind of put their stamp on this place kind of earlier on, in a time where there was a lot more skepticism. There still is skepticism, but there was even more. And they're really looking at kind of narrow problems in the near term. Where can AI make a difference, rather than, what could be possible in 8 years? It's interesting also to see, where there's kind of founder-led approaches. So 8VC was one that really took the perspective of, this space is moving so quickly. We're really looking to the community of people out there who are bringing us stuff we'll never even think of, versus the, we're creating a brain trust and trying to develop that internally. And also seeing where VCs specialize around certain axes. So, for example, Foresight Labs, for their incubated companies, they're really thinking about data, human data, as this critical resource to bear, but also data analytics capabilities. So things like, how do you set up massively parallel experiments and analyze them in statistically robust ways? How do you look at the genomics data coming in from all over the world and analyze it properly? And they are looking to bring those resources to bear. The long story short is that it's a varied landscape of how VCs are approaching this. And it was really interesting to dive in and talk to a fairly representative little swath of them.
Another interesting axis in there was those who believe in the infrastructure company, like the tools and services, as a good place to play, versus those who are sticking with the therapeutic applications. And so you kind of like took a bunch of investors and laid them out along that axis as well.
Yeah. And, there is a sense of, for some of them, and I think Dimension and Lux were in this bucket, where in order for the AI-driven therapeutics companies to be successful, the infrastructure needs to be there. So things like wet lab robotics and data analysis capabilities, it's part of the enabling unlock for the therapeutics companies. But there's also, and kind of range of views on this, but this idea that those businesses can be important value drivers in their own right. And here, everyone pointed to Viva Systems as kind of the poster child for this. They actually kind of quietly started out in 2007 with very little in private funds. They went public in 2013, and now they've got a market cap, as of my story, of around 35 billion. And they're kind of seen as a leading provider of life sciences software as a service. And so they really kind of rode in, I think, the cloud computing type of wave and bringing that to the life sciences industry. So the question is, are there more plays like that can really take off?
All right, Stephen, Selena, Lauren, let's end it on, what is the one readout you've got on the calendar circled 3 times in red? Stephen?
It's phase 3 data from Novartis for pelacarsen, their LP-A inhibitor.
All right, Selena.
Well, we already mentioned semaglutide and Alzheimer's, but I will say, I think we might have the first approvals for blood tests for Alzheimer's disease, and that could have that's under readout, but it could have a big effect on treatment and the future of that space.
Oh, for sure, for sure. All right, Lauren, bring us home.
Right, Steven took mine. That's the only one we haven't mentioned. But one thing I will say is we'll see the first data for a prime editor from Prime Medicine. So that's proof of concept data that I think will be interesting at some point this year.
All right. Well, if you have a readout that you are excited about, you can drop us a line. If you have a question for us, hit us up. There's a link in the show notes. You can go to biocenturypodcast.com to catch all these stories. They're also just on biocentury.com, and there's links in the show notes. So that is the 2025 Public Markets Preview and the 2025 Catalyst, and of course, Karen's AI VC interface story. And don't forget to tune in on Thursday on our sister podcast, where Simone will be chatting with Steve about what the new administration holds for biotech. And of course, like us, subscribe to us, and we will catch you next Monday. Special thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra for providing the music for BioCentury this week.
BioCentury would like to thank Icon Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how Icon Biotech can help you meet your critical milestones, go to iconplc.com/biotech.